Sherin Guirguis' work probes and revises our notions of abstraction, of the decorative, of the relation between the private and the public, and of feminine agency, sidestepping established narratives of Western art history. She brings new meaning and political valence to what is often hijacked as a separate formalist sphere. Her biography can perhaps shed light on this. Born in Luxor, raised in Cairo, Guirguis emigrated to the United States at age 14. As a woman of the Arabic diaspora, she enriches our vision of abstraction and the decorative by invoking a millennial tradition that is too often exoticized, silenced, and refused agency in the post-9/11 global climate and now under Trumpism. She received a BA in painting and sculpture from UC Santa Barbara in 1997, and an MFA in painting from the University of Nevada in 2001. She has had solo exhibitions at the Artist Lab residency of the 18th Street Art Center in Santa Monica, at the Third Line Gallery in Dubai, at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Arizona, and at LAX Art. Her work has been shown at LACMA, at the California African American Museum, in the official collateral exhibition of the Venice Biennial, and at the LA Municipal Gallery, and is in the collection of LACMA, Orange County Museum of Art, and Houston Museum of Fine Art, among others. In 2014, she was granted the City of Los Angeles Individual Artist Fellowship. She's currently an associate professor in the practice of fine art and vice dean at USC. If you feel called to a desert trip for spring break, her piece, One I Call, a site-specific sculpture modeled after a traditional pigeon towers found throughout the desert villages of Egypt, is currently on view as part of the Desert X Biennial in Palm Springs until April 30th. And I think she's going to speak about that also. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming Sherin Guirguis.
Nora, I think you did such a good job. I have almost nothing left to do. Thanks for having me. I think, I've been having to do a lot of talks around this, but this is probably the most nerve-wracking audience because it's all my friends and my colleagues and my students. So here we go. So I, decided in the end to start from the most recent work and work backwards, only because this feels really present for me right now, and I'm just off of installing this work, and I think I'm in a good place to kind of talk about it, and maybe you guys can help me figure out what it is. So I was invited to do this project called Desert X, and Desert X is this is the inaugural version of a biennial that they haven't quite decided whether it's really going to be a biennial or triennial or never happen again. So it's one of those projects that you're like, okay, I guess we're doing this, And as per usual, the curator and the executive director came and they did the studio visit and like, oh, we love your sculptures and, the Bedouin earrings, and it would be great to have those in the desert. And I had a picture of these pigeon towers pinned to my wall for about 3 years in the studio, just kind of sitting there. And I said, yeah, it would really be great to do the sculptures I almost always do. Except I have this thing, and I started to talk to them about this, why I thought this pigeon tower was important, and why I thought that bringing, just kind of like dropping my work in the desert without really considering the site fully was not the way I wanted to approach the project. Now, thankfully, they were both extremely accommodating and interested and willing to take that risk, where I'm just showing them a single photograph that I didn't take and saying, I'm going to make this thing that I've never done before and use a material that I've never used before and kind of do this project that is well outside of my practice. And they're both apparently hardcore risk takers because they both said, sure, this sounds great. So so then I was stuck with the problem of having to make it. So these pigeon towers, as Nora indicated, are found all over Egypt, especially along the villages along the Nile, all the way from Luxor, where I was raised, up the Delta. And they function on a lot of different ways, kind of as these architectural monuments that would mark the outside edges of the villages. They were the mail system for a really long time before mail was accessible to villages on the outskirts. And the species of pigeons that were bred for these were it's like a single species of pigeon. It's only found in Egypt. In this particular case, they race them, they trade them, they kidnap them from each other. The old ones get converted to food. So there is a kind of history of these as part of the public space, and I was kind of interested in that. There's also the notion of this invisible message going through the sky. So thinking about how this clandestine messaging was happening from village to village, especially during the British occupation. Troops would kind of wander through the villages and do what troops do when they wander through colonized places. And these messenger pigeons were one of the main warning signs and ways of communicating, and I just love this idea, again, that this becomes not just a monument for a place and a monument for communication, but a monument for activism. Okay.
So do they live inside of there? They travel through the holes?
So this is a coop, essentially. So inside there are little niches that they can nest in.
So those don't go all the way inside?
They go all the way inside. And then inside there's also little, I don't know if I have a picture of it inside though. So yeah, the holes go all the way in. So anyways, I had been thinking about the structure for a while. And as with all my projects, what I normally do, or had been kind of traditionally doing, is work on paper and sculpture. Yeah.
Sorry, that's what I was.
You're so interruptive. Okay, go ahead.
You're probably going to answer it. I apologize.
No, I'm just kidding. It's actually better if you ask me questions because I'm sure I'm forgetting stuff.
Why are they shaped like that?
Why are they shaped like that? Because it's maybe, I don't know, it's probably just more architecturally sound. Although they come in different shapes, and I'm going to show some different ones now. So it just, it's better if they're up high, obviously, because then they're not interrupted by people and traffic. And like I said, they're kind of like beacons and monuments. So kind of when you see them, you know that you're at the edge of this specific space in this specific village. So this one on the left is actually in Qatar, and it's humongous. So you could kind of see like the size of the door. And usually the doors weren't always even person size, because you just kind of crawl in and then you kind of take care of the pigeons and feed them and whatever from the inside. This one on the right is from Egypt. I'll show a couple more. And so you can really see that they're not, even though I had the picture of the one in Qatar, which is like beautiful and finished and like this glamorous form, as I started to research, realizing that really the functional ones, a lot of them, and the ones I sort of remember were more like this, which is kind of weathered and baked and used and kind of alive. And so I just kind of thought I'd show you what my process was like, and kind of like looking at how far back this idea of messenger and homing pigeons was like, and kind of the collecting of these. And then of course, very quickly, I realized that this is not just common in Egypt, but all over Africa, all over the rest of the Middle East. And anyway, so I decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do for this project, because again, thinking about, well, what does it mean to be a person from the desert? There's kind of an expectation that you're like the desert person in the show. And then, but then it's not my desert, you know what I mean? It's like we're talking about Coachella Valley. That's like literally the other side of the world, right? So, and being from a place that has a kind of like touristic exploitation thing going on, and growing up in a place where tourists would come by and I was walking around and be like, oh, so, you know what I mean? Like, so having experienced that in a direct way. The one thing I didn't want to do is to plop in, make my sculpture, even though it related to the desert, but make sure that like the concept, the form, the research, the trajectory, the like expectation that I have of my audience all really was ingrained in that site, that specific desert, that specific history. Now, of course, there's a lot of crossover, which is beautiful. You know, the idea of following water and water rights and how the water travels through the desert in the Coachella Valley, or doesn't travel through the desert in the Coachella Valley. Thinking about the relationship between native and tribal relationships with the desert versus contemporary relationships. So you had like Palm Springs with the spas and the hotels and the pool parties, and you had the Salton Sea and Mecca, where it was mainly agriculture communities, migrant communities, extremely impoverished communities, and everything in between. So thinking about, okay, how do you contain all those histories? Do I touch on all that? How do I even just find a way where, like a place where we can meet there, where my experience and this experience and my, you know, experience of desert culture and this experience of desert culture can find a connection. And so the idea of creating an adobe building felt like it was a good connection, and thinking about refuge and thinking about sanctuary, I think felt like it was the right place to meet. So I started at the Salton Sea thinking, you know, it's a wildlife refuge, and specifically for birds, because it's a major stop on the Pacific Flyway, so they have over 400 species of birds that travel up and down, and then realizing that, you know, everything about the Salton Sea just didn't work. You know, like every turn was a problem, and then I had remembered that I'd been in a place called Whitewater, which is at the mouth of the San Gorgonio Pass, and I had been there a really long time ago, so I went back and I visited, and here I am driving off the freeway, and everything kind of just started falling away. Like the city fell away, and internet fell away, and phone service fell away, and then you're just like in between these two beautiful mountains. There's snow caps in the front. You're crossing, like four-wheel driving over a rushing waterfall over this road, and I was like, wow, you know, I hadn't seen this part of the desert in this way. Now, granted, we had an especially wet winter, but it was transformative, and it was wonderful to see that even my own expectations of what the desert was providing as far as sight were immediately turned around, you know. And so so I decided Whitewater would be the place because it had this really beautiful, complicated history itself too. So it used to be obviously tribal land, and a lot of those tribes were eventually pushed out into other parts, you know, into specific areas for reservation. And then it was privatized for cattle ranching, and then a huge trout farm was installed there. So it became basically blocked public access to all this wilderness. And it was also the source of water, and so all the water coming through, the snow melt was going through a trout farm before it went into the river. So there was a lot of kind of interesting politics around it that I didn't know, and I thought would be interesting for people to learn about. And then I might skip back to something, but actually I'm going to stay here for a second longer. So anyway, so I picked this site, and again, like it was nice how all the different components, with all the work, I'm looking at a piece of text, a piece of lost history, and a specific site that deals with public and private space. So it kind of checked off all the things I'm usually interested in, but then I had to make it, right? And somebody like through a million different removed connections, somebody was like, oh, Cal Earth, there's a place called Cal Earth in Hesperia, and they specialize in adobe building, and you could go take a workshop there and learn how to make it. I was like, great, I'm gonna go take a workshop at Cal Earth, and I'm gonna make this thing myself, you know. So naturally, Not possible. So I learned again. This is the fun part about doing these things on the fly, with with like 6 months lead time, right? So I did really have to deliver. So I researched CalEarth. I went to their open house, and I realized not only was this exactly the method I wanted to use, but that there was another lost history here. And thinking about how I understood and was taught to think about sustainable architecture, right? And whose names would come to mind and what periods would come to mind when I thought about sustainable architecture was certainly not this. I was thinking about Buckminster Fuller. I was thinking about modernism. I was thinking about all these kind of very Eurocentric, historical narratives. However, here we're talking about an ancient technology that was revived by an architect working for NASA in the U.S. That I didn't know about and most people don't know about. So I kind of discovered the word of and the legacy of Nader Khalili, who basically quit his job in kind of a more formal architectural way in order to think about sustainability and think about using the materials that exist, that are accessible to any and every person in order to create a basic stable shelter, right? So philosophically, I thought, it's amazing that we're not talking about this, so that became the lost history I was interested in engaging. So there he is on top of one of the domes there. So he actually worked first to, not just to kind of create a system for creating these buildings, but to also go through and have it approved through policy so that you could get a permit to build these in California, where there are a lot of earthquake regulations and things like that. So he had to build them and then have them tested and then go through the approval process and submit certain, so it was like this whole thing. So he really was more of a humanitarian, I think, and a philosopher than even an architect. And he was a Rumi scholar. I mean, this guy is just one of those people you wish you met. So I ended up meeting basically his apprentices and his students who traveled around the world making refugee camps, schools, orphanages, for, I don't know, I mean, it's kind of amazing. And so, yeah, I don't know. So meeting these people and working with them really changed the dynamic of the project altogether, because it wasn't just about making a sculpture anymore. It's about making a structure with history and about the tradition of earth building, the language of earth building, and the philosophy of earth building, which again brought me back to the history of that site, right? So how do we think about the desert as a site to be conquered or colonized? Or do we think of the desert as a site to be respected and worked with, worked around and kind of, I don't know, I haven't found the right word for that. It's kind of accepted with all its harshness and with all its severity and all its beauty. I mean, it's a sublime place. So, yeah. So the last bit is the text, and I was already looking at a lot of Rumi poetry from the series I had just done before, and lo and behold, that poem really felt like it needed to play again for me for this piece. And you're just seeing a little excerpt of it, but it kind of gives you the idea where he kind of denies all these relationships with place and with otherness, and he finds himself at the end of this kind of marginalized place, but this very whole place. So it's a beautiful poem. I wish I could give you the title, but a lot of these are not titled. But it really hit home for me because as, again, a person of the diaspora and a person who's lived in all these places and experienced all these different cultures, you really are never home. You're really never in that comfort zone. I go back to Egypt and I'm the American. And when I'm here, I'm the Arab, And so you're constantly being othered no matter where you are. And so you're always in that space. You're neither from here or there. You're in the placeless, traceless place. So I fell in love with the poem over again. And I used the last 3 words as the title of the piece. And again, thinking about the tower as a cipher for all these narratives, both my narrative and the narrative of that place, you know, and using the architecture and the material as a way to kind of like almost embody these stories.
Did you say where the poem came from?
It's a Rumi poem.
Okay.
And like I said, it's like one of the odes, but there's like 500, so you just gotta flip through. I don't even know how I came across it. Again, it's one of those things that had been like sitting, kind of working off of it, and every now and again it clicks into what I'm doing, and I, you know, grab it, and then I let it go. So I met this team, and we went out to the site, and we started working, and very quickly I realized that this is not going to be a typical art-making process for all the obvious reasons. So the tools were very, very elementary. We had all the soil sourced from the place. So one of the things about working in a location that belongs to the Wildlife Conservancy is that it's a leave no trace site. Therefore, everything I bring in, I have to take out. They have a lot of endangered species there, so they really are very careful about introducing any foreign materials into the space. So I had to collaborate very, very closely with the director of the preserve to make sure that all the materials were not going to jeopardize their kind of mini environment there. And which worked great for me because my idea around this was to actually use the soil from there, use the earth from there, and build this thing, and in 3 months, crack open the bags and then degrade it back in and it disappears. So the idea of, again, like a cipher that pops up, it holds the story, it holds the memory, right? And then it's a site for interaction, it's a place, it's a sculpture, it's all of these things. And then it's just kind of this moment in time and it's ephemeral and it goes away. So that worked, luckily. And normally, you saw in Nader's picture, he'd created these polypropane bags, but of course I was not going to use that at the preserve because they leave little bits of plastic. So we sourced these burlap bags that are used for agricultural purposes. They're stuffed with straw to make terracing. So we use that. And I love this picture because when I started building these, I was like, this looks like a war barricade. You know, the barbed wire, the burlap, the sandbags, like these are the materials of making war. And I love that he was able to, and through this process, I was able to convert these materials into a sanctuary instead. So this is Human Fazli. I love this picture of him. So Human is the lead earth builder. He was Nader's main apprentice, and again, through strange, weird, like multi-layered relationships, I ended up running into Human, and I called him. I said, you know, I want to make this thing, and he's like, you are not allowed to make a pigeon tower without me. I grew up with these. He's from Iran, and he's like, I've always wanted to make one, so we're going to collaborate on this with you, because Nader Khalili's were all domes for structural reasons, and now I'm trying to make it into this tower, which is not as structurally sound, and so I needed a real expert to help me do it. And Human's one of those people who, you know, again, like I started to understand earth builders a little bit more. Everything is possible until it's not possible, and then we'll just find another way around it, and I just kind of was wonderful to be in that place with them for a month. So anyways, he's watering. He's watering the building, which he did very carefully all the time, like watering, making sure the soil and the mud was, you know, and he tended to the like earth and to the mud piles very carefully. And all, I love that, you know, the tools, again, we use were like a chain, a pendulum, crushing the mud in your hand and then just seeing, is it going to hold together well or not? Does it have enough clay or not? Everything was there. There wasn't heavy equipment. There wasn't drilling and hammering and cranes and, you know, so everything about it was poetic. So we started going, and we decided to make it really structurally sound. We were going to make a cylinder, and then we'll make the dome on top, sitting on top of the cylinder. You can sort of see here, I wish I had a wider shot, I think I have one later, what this location really looks like. It's stunning. The rock face was, the reason I found it to be really even aesthetically suitable is because all these pockholes where the boulders had fallen out of the rock were then occupied with birds. Did you guys see any of the sheep when you were there? Flocks, like huge flocks of endangered bighorn sheep would come while we're working and graze on the cliff. It's just, you know, it's like you're in paradise, you know. So, you know, it just, again, and like I said, like no phones, no cell, nobody knows where you are, like, you know, it's just you're really in that creative space in the most romantic possible freaking way. And of course, just kind of having this bird tower right in front of where the birds really are, and kind of thinking about, you know, formally how this shape slowly started to sink into its environment because it's made out of the same materials. And it really was that beautiful. So we started laying up the bags and then applying mud to the outside of the bags to kind of seal it. One of the other decisions we had to make was whether to add concrete or not to stabilize the building, because normally they would add a certain amount of concrete to stabilize it. Again, because of the site, because of conceptually how I wanted the piece to function and whether over time, we decided to build it unstabilized. So there's nothing inside the bags except soil. There's nothing on the from the preserve, and then there's nothing on the outside except mud, also from the preserve. And when I say mud, I mean like the most beautiful, the most glamorous, the most sparkly, the most, you know, you've never seen mud like this. It's, you know, it's pink, you know, it's just very, very glamorous mud. So we're working, we're building. I'm traveling back and forth teaching and building and teaching and building. And you can see the team up there. So every single one of these guys apprenticed and is a specialist in this way of building, and they travel, like I said, all over the country doing this work. And I could tell you, not for a lot of money. And so it's really inspiring. And you know, the minute we were done, they all spread out again doing their different projects. This day, I got a call from Palm Springs High School, and they said, we want to come see the Desert X projects. I was here teaching, so I left them in Human's hands, and he tells this really great story because he said, well, you know, high school students, so they came. They looked, they rolled their eyes, they just said nothing, and then after a while, you know, the guys are building, oh, hand me this thing, oh, hand, you know, because this basically, again, you can see there's no scaffolding, you know, you're handing up buckets of earth that people are filling into the bags on top of the building. This is the whole technology. And sure enough, by the end of it, those guys, they're working, they're mudding, they all have like stripes of mud, you know, all over their bodies, and they're like, we love this, where do we go learn how to do this? And when I heard this story, I just thought, oh, good, we can stop now because we're done. You know, we're done. We came to a place, we made a work about that place. The history of Adobe and Adobe structures is fully rooted in this part of the desert, and then we have people from that place engaged, you know. So that felt good. I just thought I'd show you guys what the inside looked like. So we, you know, I decided to leave the inside raw, burlap, so that there's a very stark difference between how the building looked from the outside and how it felt from the inside. And the inside, it's like a sweater. You know, you're in, it's like cozy, it absorbs sound, and you're really cocooned in there. But it's also very tall, and the light's coming through, and using the gold leaf to kind of bounce the light even more, and to think about that idea that Julia, you and I were talking about. It's like this idea of like the divine word coming, the divine kind of space. So referencing all of that, as I was thinking about the Rumi poem, I think this is where I was really focusing. And then marking the geometry with the three branches, the triangle, so rotating. So it's like the top 3, 6, 9, 12, you know, so really kind of getting into the kooky sublime geometry. So that was fun too. And just took some pictures of kind of the inside, outside. And I love, again, the idea of like public space, private space, being inside something, being outside something, how every, you know, looking from the inside out forces you to focus into these particular spaces. And I plan very carefully where you're looking. It's like almost creating these stills as you were inside the building, looking either up at the sky, you know, very early Terrell, right? Through the oculus, and then I know I'm terrible. And then these kind of framed vignettes. So that's what it looked like in the end. And it had 3 of these oval entryways.
Sherin, will you document its decay?
Yeah, I am slowly. I don't know how fastidious I am about that because I just don't know. But they have a photographer that's going through and taking pictures. I'm going through and taking pictures. But yes. So again, this is that white shot I was telling you about. So from the bottom of the valley with the rushing white water to, you know, in the sands of the desert to the snow peaks of San Gorgonio. So, you know, I had a lot of help from the site. This is opening day, just to give you a scale. All the fancy art people.
Did you get to choose the exact site?
I did. But, you know, honestly, we walked through. I had a couple sites before we got into the preserve that were up against the rocks that I liked. But when Jack, the director, kind of walked me down this trail, I was like, that's it. You know, this is the first trail we went down. I'm like, I don't even need to see anything else. And since then, I've walked around a lot of the preserve area, and this still feels like the right spot. And so during the previews, I had also, during the research, I met everybody. I met so many different kinds of people. I met, of course, with a lot of the tribal community, and I had been thinking about how to use sound in this piece, and after a lot of kind of back and forth, I decided I wasn't going to use sound, but it turned out that this person I'd met is a bird singer, part of the Agua Caliente tribe, and bird singers basically tell stories and histories and mythologies about the tribe through these songs. And so he said that he would come and sing. So let's see if we can get it to work. Yeah, you can. Can you sort of hear it?
Is your computer not connected to the sound now?
No, it's not. Could you barely hear it? You could barely hear it at the opening too, because because he was inside and you can only fit like 3 or 4 people, and it kind of muffled the sound, and then everybody else had to kind of like, you know, sort of hear it. So that's perfect. We rendered it perfectly. So that, you know, again, like it felt like I was doing only like part of the work with this piece. A lot of it was just coming together magically. Yes, Edgar.
So this is part of the construction that seems very bodily, like almost intestinal. At least from the outside, it just looks like ribs of a rib cage.
Most people found that to look like a beehive, but okay.
Yeah. So I'm wondering. You know, I've never seen a real beehive outside. You know, like being a city kid, you see
Urban
beehives
people.
in walls. I've seen a
Yeah,
cartoon.
but you've seen the inside of the body.
Well, I mean, I guess it looks like a cartoon beehive, but I'm
Yeah, it does.
curious, like, from
Yeah.
a certain, like, this could be, you know, the inside of,
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
I guess
yeah.
it's the doorway that kind of got me too, because it, you know, it looks like the.
Well, for something so phallic, it definitely felt kind of feminine and woomy. and warm and interior. So I think I managed to put those two dualities together. Probably intestines. Why not? And then as it rained and the mud on the top leaked, and I meant to put that picture in here, but I forgot. The mud started leaking in and dripping down the burlap inside. So which is something I didn't expect, and then it definitely felt more kind of bodily in that way. Visceral and bodily.
Well, I mean, there's some direct connection between our interior psychologies and the ways in which our body works, and then how we project into space the kind of structures that we want our bodies to occupy. Right?
Certainly.
So I was just curious how the construction method, did it surprise you how it started to feel like other things or look like other things, or was the beehive kind of?
Well, yes and no, because none of us really knew what exactly it was going to look like. You know what I mean? So we had this loose doodle of like, I want this shape. You know, we had these pictures to look at. But again, because of the nature of this process, you have to adopt to the layer underneath, right? So with the exception of the column, we had to kind of work with what we had as far as the dome and making it round on the inside or making it round on the outside. You know, like, so how far in do we want to, like, a step inside? You know, so there was a lot of giving up of control of the form in a certain way. So I don't know that I set up a particular expectation of, like, I want it to feel X, Y, Z. I did want it to feel, like I said, like a container, like a cipher, or like, I had a really kooky name for it. I can't remember. Oh, I said it was like a soul oven, right? So you're inside, and it's hot, and it's tight, and it's accentuated, and it's like a sweat lodge or something. But really, again, you're not really supposed to be in these things, you know, and that's why the door is not really a door, right? It's elevated up. You have to crawl and climb in, really, because they're not made for you. Yeah, that's my unanswered answer. Any other questions? Yes?
Did birds settle in there?
No,
Do you have birds in
they
there?
definitely didn't.
No.
Why would you have all these tourists running around when you could be at the top of the mountain away from them? No, and I don't expect that they do. I mean, they have been curious. Everybody's been curious. The sheep and we've got a lot of, like, low-flying visitors and rabbits and cows, leftover cows from the ranches. Yeah.
What was the most, like, I guess the easiest thing that happened and the hardest thing that happened, and, like, maybe in the idea that, like, nature can surprise you, like?
The easiest thing was feeling a relief from having to control every aspect. And that was obviously also the hardest thing. And it sucked to have 2 days of rain where we couldn't work. That's fun.
What's the gold leaf wrapped around?
Pipes. So there are these PVC pipes that basically are forms that we use to create the circles around. Which is, I think, the only non-biodegradable item. Yeah.
You mentioned this is outside of your previous practice. Do you think that this is going to inform your work moving forward?
I think, yeah. I mean, naturally.
Or do you think you would go in this route or something?
Like, will I forever build clay pigeon towers? I hope not, but I do think that it's not completely disconnected from what I've been doing. It's just an entirely different way of thinking about those things. So I've constantly been thinking about, like I said, these lost histories. I'm constantly thinking about geometry and ornamentation and site and architecture and politicizing those things and not making those things neutral. And, so it didn't feel like as big of a jump as it ended up being, and will I not do any works on paper anymore? No, obviously I will. So I think it just probably will seep in somehow. I would like to keep my hands in earth somehow. The one art class I didn't take was ceramics, so so I might have to revisit. But thinking about that moldability in a different way, but also working on this and putting, like, say, example, the mod layer, which is essentially like painting. We were just like with sponge painting with the mud, and it's dripping, and it really reminded me of how I was dealing with watercolor. So watercolor on paper and using air and gravity to move it around and create these kind of drips. That was happening here. Anyway, so there was a very strong relationship that I hadn't expected to either in there. So yeah, I'm sure it'll seep in. I'm not sure how, but yeah. Any other questions? Do you want to see old work, or is this good?
Yeah.
Really? More. Okay. So then I will go back. I'll just show like 1.5 things. So this is before. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I had been doing up to the tower. So this is a picture of Hoda Sharawi and 2 other women who were the founders of the, and because it's a vintage photo, it was hard to actually get the names of the women working with her. But she's the founder of the women's movement in Egypt. And I had been doing research. So part of being an immigrant and living in diaspora and moving when you're 14 and you weren't a really good student, and I was like, how did I not know about the feminist movement in Egypt? This is so crazy. I must have been asleep in history class. And I called a couple of friends of mine who are scholars, and just like, where is this in history? It's just like, well, we don't learn that in history book. You don't learn this in public school. And there it was. So things just are going to happen to fall in place. And so I started reading her memoirs, which had a beautiful Orientalist title called The Harem Years, Hoda Sharawi, The Harem Years. And because she was, presented to the West as the last woman who had been known to live in a real live harem. And so it's there's an interesting little side note there. But so reading her story, really she was raised in a harem, separated from her siblings who were male, put in the harem with the women, and then in this big beautiful castle in Cairo, she decides she actually wants to sort of learn to read and write and go to salons and be literate. And so she would sneak into, and listen into the salons they would have at the house, and eventually all the men died, and then she got the house. And she started using the house as a clandestine, is that the right word? Space for the meetings of the women's groups, and to hold salons, and to read books, and to have discussions. They published a paper called Daughters of the Nile. They would travel all over the world and attend feminist conferences. So they came back at
What year is this? Sorry.
30s-ish, 20s-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very ish about dates.
That's okay. Thank you.
So they come back. So this is the picture of them coming back on the train station. This is the train station as it looks today, which almost has no change. And they come back from Italy from this women's conference, and Hoda and her colleagues stand on the track and they take off the veil. And all the women that were waiting to greet them take off the veil and they walk into the street. Side note, the veil at that time was not a religious construct. It was a social construct. And women who lived in harems, women that were from high society, would always wear a white veil over their clothes. So again, thinking about this as a feminist place as opposed to a religious kind of spiritual move, I thought was really interesting, because I hadn't really understood the history of the veil in that way. So anyway, so I had the lost history, I had the architectural site, and I created work. So I usually create work out of paper, because I'm interested, again, in all of the no-nos that I wasn't supposed to do. Like craft, beauty, women's work, feminism, all the dirty words, right? So I just put them all together and figured, fuck it. So those works you see there are watercolor and acrylic and ink on paper, and then they're hand cut. All the Arabic geometry is hand cut out of it. And then, so this is actually 2 series of works. Let me see, how many of these did I actually put in? Okay, I put a few. So this is just kind of just to show you scale. So you can kind of see the reference here to the architecture of the train station facade. The paper is painted with a fluorescent color on the back, so what looks like pink in the background is actually a reflection of the light. So one of the things I've become really interested in is kind of reversing the sampling that has been happening from kind of male modernist artists of Southern and tribal and ancient cultures, like sampling African masks and sampling, South American sculpture, kind of reversing that. So I was sampling light and space, I was sampling from Eames and Noguchi and thinking about, again, kind of maybe reversing that agency and thinking about how do I politicize this ornamental, decorative language? And if I put these 2 things together, can I really find a visual language that could describe this liminal space that I'm not trying to, but I'm kind of finding myself in, right? So thinking about abstract painting, its history, and its kind of, especially in California, its rejection of politics, its rejection of any kind of like symbolic shaping and ornamentation. Like this, I was thinking, how do I still maintain that language and then still engage in abstraction, and still connect with the history of abstraction in some way, because it's important to me, because I'm interested in it. And so this is the door. So this is based on the door to Huda's house. The door to the train station. And then these, can you tell what these are? Yeah, so that picture of the pigeon tower that was hanging on my wall. So I was kind of just making those, even though they were like these blobs. But then they started to look like figures, and they started to kind of lean, and you can see here with the close-up that I'm really trying to play off of this idea of formal and informal systems, the hard edge geometry that feels really like, I don't know, clean or something and organized. And then the more abstract and kind of organic painting, and then when you really look at it, and this works in person better than it does in slide, but you start to see that the geometry starts to come apart, actually. And in the geometry, you see the flaws, and you see the mistakes, and you see the handmade quality of the hand cutting, and you don't really see that in the painted areas. And so there's a constant flip-flop between our expectation of how these 2 very different systems work. And I was hoping that in presenting that in a formal way, that I can then access a conceptual idea around how, when formal systems fail us, we use informal systems to replace them. And it's just how we value these things. So crossing the street in Cairo is like taking, you've done it, right? It's like taking your life in your own hands, right? You're just like donkey carts and buses and motorcycles and beeping and no lights and no lanes. But it works. People cross the street in Cairo all the time, right? But coming from LA, I go back home, I'm like, what is this chaos? It makes no sense. But it's actually a different kind of music. It's a different kind of symphony. And everybody's kind of like the beeping and the walking and the dancing and the waving, and it works. It's just not what I expected and not what I was taught to value. So I'm trying to play this trick where I can use very formal, very abstract, systems or kind of formulas to talk about a lot of these complicated, contradictory notions around being from two places. Are you bored yet? Sometimes the geometry wins, sometimes the painting wins.
Are these all really big?
Yeah, well, I really wanted them to feel as close to life sizes, and because there are doors and windows and things, they really did. Back to what Edgar was saying earlier, the relationship to the body was really important with these because I didn't have an actual piece of architecture to kind of engage the body with, so the scale then gave you that. And they are floated off the back to allow for the fluorescent color to bounce, and also for shadows. So there's another layer of drawing that happens when the shadows of the geometry gets projected on the back. And then you can sort of see, so sometimes the pencil underneath kind of drawing stays, and sometimes it doesn't stay. How are we doing on time?
7.
Okay, I'll show you this next piece. So what the sculptures that related were based on another book called the Cairo Trilogy, which is by Naguib Mahfouz, who is a Nobel laureate, one of probably the most well-known and probably the most talented writer, I think, in Egypt and probably in the Middle East. And he wrote this series of fictions that were set in the period, right before and right after the British occupation. It follows a single family that is under kind of like a strict patriarchal rule, and how that kind of structure crumbles, and then the female characters start to leave the house and lead the family. So it's this kind of 3-part series, and they're named after real streets in Cairo. And so I liked showing these two bodies of work, one based on a fiction and one based on a nonfiction, and kind of but in the same time period, and kind of showing that parallel. One that was kind of subdued and kind of made invisible, and one that was extremely popular because it was fictitious. So you're allowed to have agency in the imagination. So I decided to make a series of 3 sculptures, one for each novel, that are around the jewelry that I imagined these women to be wearing, and they were kinetic in a way to reflect the movement of the body in the public space. It was based on some of the vignettes. Pardon?
How do they move?
They move like this. So the first one is the most rigid. It moves on a single axis. And none of them, again, like there's no automation. It's a strictly Eames construction, plywood, ebony veneer, and they're just sliced together. No motor, no battery, no solar. And it just sits there. And then usually about a 12-year-old walks in the gallery and goes, and then it's like, oh shit, and then and then it happens, and then it activates the space, and so it requires a certain amount of transgression. Thank you, transgression or whatever you want to call it, to kind of complete the piece. Oh, I forgot to put the video for this one. This one's really good. This one is the one that the registrar really hated. So this one. This one was weighted with lead in the middle so that it was like a weeble wobble, right? Is that what you call it? And so that one was extremely violent and dangerous, or really beautiful, So the other one you could kind of get out of its way, whereas this one, in a crowded space, you're going to definitely get knocked on the head. So, there's a kind of responsibility, there's a kind of like, again, transgression, there's a kind of relationship that has to happen between you and the rest of the people viewing the piece, and your ability to kind of interact with artwork in a museum space in that way. And so anyways, that was a good one.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you give people permission to touch it?
I didn't.
So they just touch it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, they totally did. I didn't. There was no sign. I think it may have said kinetic sculpture. They did, yeah, they did. The registrar called me like every few minutes, like, it's leaning, and you know, and the spotlight was over here, and then like 3 days later, the piece is over there. You know, and it weighs like 5 tons, so you know, can't really move it back. So it had an interesting, I mean, it's funny, but it's also, again, like a metaphor for, you know, this is 2012. So it was, again, a metaphor for activism, for engagement, for like, in a way, positive transgression, and this kind of ability to take a risk to try something and push something further, but without me having to do it, you know, making you guys do it. So. And then the last one I decided was not going to be kinetic, because in the last one, it didn't feel like there was, like, that the book, the story is not complete. And so really in the last one, it felt like it was in progress or coming apart, you know, so the last one was this teardrop one. Okay, that really is it.
Is this the one that's at the County Museum?
Yeah, that is. Oh, sorry.
You want the last one?
Sure.
Great.
I'll leave this on because it's pretty. Do you guys have any other questions? Karen.
Back to the paintings.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you not consider the blowing paint parts decorative?
Oh yeah.
Would you say?
Oh yeah. I mean, I do think that there is a history of action painting specifically, and Abek's language of painting that recognizes that as painting, you know, and as legitimate abstraction, and like within the vernacular of American, you know, mark making. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's why I think I use it in a way that could be construed as decorative for sure. And that's again that weird space where it kind of becomes decorative.
Right. Yeah.
Well, is part of the point.
When you were saying the decorative elements, I actually didn't know which, because I could argue that that's more decorative than
exactly.
Parts.
But you know, so thinking about ornamentation and how ornamentation has been specifically excluded from the language of abstraction and of painting as decorative and as frivolous, while we're making these marks anyway, and those are perfectly acceptable marks. So that's not really about the mark anymore, it's about something else. It's about politics. It's about where that mark comes from. It's about why we consider that type of ornament, like abstraction or that type of mark making, decorative. And it's dismissed because it's tribal and it's ancient and it belongs over here, and you know, we can just sample from it. But you know, we have this new universal language that doesn't deal with, you know, and that's why I know Amelia hates it, but like I always refer to the Adolf Loss article, because it's like it's right there in black and white, and it's that moment where you really start separating out a long history of art from a lot of different places because it doesn't fit into your paradigm, you know. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's decorative.
Yeah.
And not.
Or it's like a little D versus a big D.
Yeah, there you go. Good question, Karen.
Terrific.
Any other questions? Good? Thanks, guys.